Okay, so we had this story yesterday about Priti Patel suggesting that people get shipped out to Ascension Island, which is there in the middle of the Atlantic, and using this as an asylum centre, a processing centre. Now, I just wanted to kind of look at the Labour reaction to this. We had the Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas Simmons, saying it's a ludicrous idea, it's inhumane, but he then says it's completely impractical and wildly expensive. So, we have what is clearly an appalling suggestion from the Home Secretary that's very much in line with what this government's doing and with her own kind of personal brand of being kind of, pushing the envelope in terms of being viciously right wing. But the Labour response tries to kind of put a foot in both camps. On the one hand, it claims a mantle to a sort of humanitarianism, but on the other hand, there's this kind of pragmatic talk about what's practical, what's expensive, and so on, and to try to kind of undermine the Tories on competency grounds, which is a very common theme from Starmer's Labour Party at the moment. And I think this kind of illustrates something that Catherine was saying about how the sort of liberal charity sector, the humanitarian response to what's going on, is lacking in very significant respects, and holds itself back and kind of sells itself short of what we really need to understand what's going on and fight what's going on more effectively. And just to kind of underline that, someone reminded me of this from 2003. This is David Blunkett, who was Home Secretary back then, New Labour, obviously. And he actually floated this idea of processing migrants and asylum seekers in offshore centres. And this was pushed quite heavily at the time. I don't think anything came of the proposal, but it's also something that wasn't simply something that David Blunkett came up with. There were other European figures, the former Director General of the Dutch Asylum Service, all came together to try to put forward this as an idea. So you can see that what many people are denouncing as this awful thing that the Tories are proposing now, a very similar thing was proposed by New Labour a while ago. In fact, we can go further back. The journalist Solomon Hughes came up with this interesting little story from 1987, where Tamil asylum seekers were refused, their claims were denied, and they ended up stranded on a prison ship. Essentially, this ship couldn't dock, and you will see that of the very few MPs who actually stood up for their plight, you got Mr. Jeremy Corbyn and Ms. Diane Abbott there. So really, I suppose what we need to see here is that what the Conservative government is doing now regarding asylum isn't something that's come completely out of the blue. It's built up on decades and decades of not simply anti-asylum seeker rhetoric, but also management of the political process and the legal process around that. So what I think you have now really is a situation where, if you look around the world, there is a rise of nationalisms of various varieties. Now, the one that you hear a lot about is the kind of right-wing so-called populist nationalism, represented to different extents by Trump in America, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Boris Johnson here in Britain. And I think it's fair to say that the majority of the sort of liberal press kind of views this authoritarian populism with a degree of suspicion and claims to be something different to that, claims to have higher values and so on, and claims act as a sort of alternative to it. However, I would argue that this nationalism that we're seeing on the rise is also rising in a much more respectable kind of way. I mean, for instance, if you look in the States, the mainstream Democratic opposition to Trump is very much built around a kind of Cold War paranoia that Trump is in the pay of the Russians in some way, you know? So there's a liberal, respectable nationalism that is also on the rise. And what I really want to stress is that liberal, respectable nationalism is just as responsible for the policing and the construction of this international borders system. I think one very obvious example of that comes from this article, which is a very good piece by Daniel Trilling that appeared in The Guardian about a week or two ago, which essentially traces how the European Union has just completely scaled back on any attempts to rescue drowning migrants in the Mediterranean, and has in fact, there's been a legal pushback against the few people who are involved in trying to rescue them. And also he talks about how the NGOs that were quite prominent in trying to help these people have now kind of pulled back in the face of these sort of legal threats and this pan-European pushback against them. So we see here that, like, you know, a kind of respectable liberal pan-European nationalism can be just as vicious as the Priti Patel version. I think really, if we think back further, there is I'd like to kind of think back to like before 2008 really, and before the credit crunch and before this current era of austerity and rising nationalism really started to kick in. Through the 90s and into the noughties, there was a general kind of feeling and general consensus across the Western world that we lived in a kind of new world order where the Cold War was over, and the respectable civilized Western capitalist nations could all club together. There was this wonderful thing called globalization that would mean that, you know, we would all come together and march off steadily unimpeded into a kind of glowing progressive future. I mean, I parody it slightly, but that was certainly the feeling around that time. And certainly you started to see, as well as globalization in terms of trade flows, you started to see much larger flows of migration, and as people moved to find where the jobs were and where the job shortages were. But during that period, you also saw the rise of the paranoia about refugees and asylum seekers that you see today. I mean, that was really pushed. It was introduced initially by John Major's government in the 90s, but was one of the first things that the new Labour government really started pushing. I remember in the late 90s and early noughties being kind of quite shocked at how suddenly it seemed out of the blue. Every newspaper, every politician was just going on about this terrible threat that floods of asylum seekers were apparently proposing to us. And a lot of the rhetoric and notion that refugees and asylum seekers were problems that needed to be managed by some kind of punitive apparatus or disciplinary apparatus really started getting put in at that point. And specifically for the management of refugees, so were a very small proportion of the actual migrant flow. But what we've seen is that those techniques have now kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger. And post the financial crash and post us leaving this so-called neoliberal golden age of globalization, those punitive and disciplinary techniques have got much, much, much more powerful and have been pushed ever further in quite a steady way, which leads to the quite extreme situation we see today. One thing that I thought I should mention as an example of this is the role that Islamophobia played in cementing the kind of current anti-migrant rhetoric. When 9/11 happened and the war on terror was declared, there was this quite conscious attempt to construct this sort of racist stereotype of the extremist Muslim jihadi that was against Western values, and a series of kind of, you know, things put in place, the Prevent scheme and what have you. But what was interesting about that is, as the decade progressed, the anti-Muslim rhetoric that had previously been quite focused around the idea of extremism, of terrorism, and so on, started to spill out into a much more general kind of classical racism, whereby Muslims were seen as a demographic threat to Europe. You know, the idea of Muslim hordes at the gates that were about to, you know, invade essentially and sweep aside a kind of coded Christian Western culture. And that's become a much more popular idea recently on the right, you know, in kind of a fascistic form around theories of great replacement and so on, the kind of conspiracy theory that, you know, globalist elites have conspired to let this happen, but also a much more general kind of common sense that all the various nationalisms we've seen rising up have been built upon an idea of values, that Britain has certain values or the West has certain common values that are not shared by these kind of brown and black faces that are coming over here. So the ideology of kind of othering people on the basis of so-called cultural values, which was pioneered by the sort of Islamophobia of the early noughties, is now the basic tool by which governments are justifying their further erection of borders and their treatment of migrants. So I just want to end with a quick kind of conclusion as to what this means. If what I'm saying makes sense and works, that what we are seeing currently in terms of the crisis faced by migrants is in fact rooted in much wider processes of what is happening internationally and what has been happening over the past 20, 30 years leading up to this. I think we're in a situation where anyone involved in migrant solidarity, we have to understand this bigger picture in order to be able to fight what is going to be a long haul fight. We have to really, I think, dig in here and start to win over quite deep political arguments about why migration is happening, why migrants are not the threat that people make them out to be, why it's important for anyone involved on the left and the socialist left in particular to fight for migrant solidarity and migrant rights. And I think as time goes on, we are in a period now where it's quite clear that imperialist rivalries between the big power blocks are ratcheting up further and further and further, especially the US versus China, which I think is hotting up into a very serious trade war. But also as the climate catastrophe starts to really bite, I think you're going to see that spilling over into wars, into regional wars, into bigger refugee shifts and so on. So these crises are going to intensify. And what we've got now is a system of national governments deploying national ideology to justify ever higher borders while simultaneously cooperating to create an international system that pushes migrants down. And that means that our solidarity has to be international. So I'm very glad to hear about the links being made between different migrant solidarity groups around the world. But it also has to be rooted in understanding of how this is not really simply a humanitarian issue. There are systemic reasons why the ruling class is doing this internationally, and our fight against what they're doing has to be rooted in understanding how that is happening and why it is happening.